Hello, I'm Keith Cate. For the second year in a row, Florida leads the nation when it comes to imposing death sentences. Right now, we have 404 death row inmates. Only California has more. State lawmakers agree something needs to be done. Maybe we reduce the number of inmates by changing the rules and speeding up executions. Or maybe we require juries reach a unanimous decision before recommending death in the first place. Both ideas are being considered. But the answers won't come easy, because when it comes to the death penalty, there is so much to consider. Take, for example, the case of Tommy Ziegler.
Eventually, time runs out for all of us.
We'll do everything we can to tell the
knows
story.
it better than
Tell
most.
it again.
He was 29 years old when a judge sentenced him to death. He'll be 68 in a few
Would
months
be.
if he
We
lives
got
that
him
long.
moved in the justice system. Once the decision is made, it's like it's set in concrete.
But concrete can crack, and Tommy started chipping away the moment a judge tried to cement his fate. Tommy Ziegler's swift journey to death row began on the night before Christmas 1975. He called police to his Winter Garden furniture store. They found Tommy bleeding from a bullet wound to the gut. Detectives also found a bloody massacre, 4 bodies. Tommy's wife Eunice, her parents Perry and Virginia Edwards, and a customer named Charlie Mays. They arrested Tommy when he woke up after surgery.
I was numb. I just couldn't believe that they were thinking that I killed somebody.
7 short months later, Tommy Ziegler was on death row.
It was a railroad job.
State prosecutors made the case that Tommy was motivated by greed. He had recently taken out 2 life insurance policies worth $250,000 each on his wife Eunice. He killed her parents because they showed up at the furniture store unexpectedly. Tommy beat the customer Charlie Mays to death with a carpet crank because he needed someone to blame. And to make his story of a botched robbery more convincing, Tommy shot himself. The state presented these facts based on circumstantial evidence and not one eyewitness.
When he was with Charlie Mays,
State Attorney
went up
Jeff
to test
Ashton
the
has fought
firearms.
to keep Tommy Ziegler on
Came
death
back
row
and-
since taking over the case in 1989.
You are convinced, without a shadow of a doubt, this man is guilty?
There's no other explanation for the evidence.
Unless you ask Tommy's
We're not
original
going to
defense
have
attorney, Vernon Davids,
federal
who
courts
believes much
protecting
of
our
the
federal
evidence,
Constitution.
like Tommy's trial, was mishandled. He has never been more convinced than he is today
To
that Tommy Ziegler
Represent
is innocent.
Andrew.
I believe he is, and I know beyond the shadow of a doubt he was railroaded by unethical conduct, deceit, and manipulation.
Tommy's legal team felt the deck was stacked against them from the beginning, starting with the judge assigned to oversee the trial. He was no stranger. Judge Maurice Paul and Tommy testified on opposite sides of an unrelated case. Tommy stood up for Andrew James, who was threatened with the loss of his liquor license at Brown's Bar.
I think Judge Paul was definitely biased and prejudiced against me because we had been on opposite sides of a case just 5 or 6 months prior to my trial. And a lieutenant with the beverage department that was a friend of his was fired because of my testimony.
Before Tommy's quadruple murder trial began, his lawyers filed 3 motions asking Judge Paul to step aside. He refused.
He knew very well that he had testified as a character witness opposite Tommy Ziegler 3 months before this happened. It was on him to do his duty and step down.
State Attorney Ashton says there was no legally sufficient reason for the judge to be disqualified.
And there's no aspect of the trial that anybody has really come up with and said, hey, this is where the judge did something unfair.
When Tommy's legal team requested more time to prepare for trial, Judge Paul said no, and he ignored our request to talk about it. Tommy's reaction to the judge's demand for a speedy trial was mixed. He knew his lawyers needed more time to prepare, but he was anxious for jurors to hear his version of what happened. The sooner he could clear his name, the better. After all, people in Winter Garden knew Tommy and Eunice Ziegler. They seemed like a normal couple, maybe even happier than most. Tommy was a young Army veteran and a volunteer football coach when they met. Eunice was a teacher. They attended church together. She played piano, he sang in the choir. They had a big wedding in 1967 and made plans to have children. They never did.
There's not a day go by that I don't think about her.
Thinking about what specifically?
What we had, what we did, what we could have had, what we could have done.
The Zieglers did have a successful business. They owned several rental properties, and from all appearances, they had a strong 9-year marriage.
Marriage was good?
Very good.
No infidelity? No stress?
No.
No domestic problems of any
Yes.
kind? Did you love Eunice?
Very much so. Very much so.
Tommy's challenge was to convince a jury that he was not a killer. He would portray himself as the 5th victim from that Christmas Eve bloodbath.
Tommy Ziegler has been fighting to get off death row for 37 years. He's accused of killing 4 people, including his wife, on Christmas Eve, 1975. Tommy had a chance to convince a jury that he was not a cold-blooded killer. He portrayed himself as a victim.
Tommy says he asked his handyman, Ed Williams, to drive him back to the store in Williams' truck so they could make some last-minute deliveries before attending a Christmas party later that night.
Tommy came in through the back door. He says the lights were out, wouldn't work. And he didn't know that Eunice and her parents had also come to the store about a half hour earlier to pick out a new chair for Mr. Edwards. It was going to be his Christmas present. Tommy says when he came through the door, 2 men ambushed him from behind, hit him in the back of the head. They struggled. Tommy reached for a gun that he kept in a desk drawer, and he says he used it as a club.
You never fired a shot?
Not to my knowledge, no.
But someone fired a shot into Tommy's stomach. That's when he hit the floor and briefly blacked out. When he came to, he crawled around in the dark looking for the phone. To his surprise, he came across a body. He said he had no clue that his wife, in-laws, or the customer, Charlie Mays, were already dead.
I crawled across somebody, but I couldn't tell who it was.
But you knew it was a body?
Yes.
State Attorney Ashton says Tommy had Charlie Mays' blood all over him, and Tommy's story about being the victim of an armed robbery has never made sense.
And it never will, because his story's a lie. Because he stood over Charlie Mays and beat him to death with that carpet crane.
To prove he was telling the truth, a doctor at a Bay Area psychiatric clinic questioned Tommy while he was under the influence of the drug sodium brevitol, sometimes referred to as truth serum. He was also given a lie detector test over the course of several hours. Experts reported not one lie.
He's a sociopath. He doesn't, in order to fail a lie detector test, you have to have an emotional reaction to lying. You have to feel bad about it. I've cross-examined Mr. Ziegler. Mr. Ziegler can lie to your face without the slightest bit of emotion, the slightest bit of concern, the slightest bit of remorse. I've seen it.
2 key witnesses backed up the state's theory and added a strange twist. Felton Thomas and the handyman Ed Williams said Tommy took them to an orange grove to test-fire guns before the murders. Tommy says that never happened.
That's ludicrous. What was the purpose of it?
The state believes Tommy wanted to get their fingerprints on the weapons and gun residue on their hands. Felton Thomas also testified that he went to the furniture store with Charlie Mays to help pick up a TV, but Tommy's strange behavior made him nervous, so he left. But Tommy says he never laid eyes on Felton Thomas until after his arrest.
The first time I saw Felton Thomas was at the preliminary hearing in January of 76.
Ed Williams' testimony was more damaging.
In 1976, Tommy Ziegler was on trial for the murder of his wife and 3 other people. He claimed that he was also a victim, jumped by robbers, shot in the stomach. There were no eyewitnesses, so the state built a case around circumstantial evidence. They also had the damaging testimony of Ed Williams, a handyman who worked for Tommy.
Ed Williams claims when he got to the furniture store to help Tommy that night, he almost lost his life. He says Tommy tried to shoot him, but the gun failed to fire.
It snapped 3 times. Yap, 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 yap. 3 times. The gun didn't fire? The gun didn't fire, but the heavy hammer hit him 3 times.
Williams, who passed away several years ago, said Tommy pretended he made a mistake and even tried to hug him. Then he said Tommy gave him the gun. Williams took it, ran away, and gave it to investigators after learning about the murders.
Edward Williams shows up the next morning with a securities industry revolver, which was his principal murder weapon.
Tommy's lawyers found it strange that the man found with the murder weapon was never looked at as a potential suspect. They tried to poke holes in Ed Williams' story. For example, if Tommy had already killed 4 people, as the state argued, he should have been covered in blood. Why didn't Williams mention that to police?
He claims I hugged him and begged him not to leave. But yet there's no blood on his clothes.
During the investigation, detectives linked 6 guns to the killings at Ziegler's furniture store. They believe more than 24 shots were fired inside. And yet,
there is no GSR, gunshot residue, on me. So explain to me how that I fired 28 gunshots and didn't get any gunshot residue on me. It's impossible.
We may never know who fired the guns because all of the weapons had been wiped clean of fingerprints. Jurors spent 20 days listening to both sides. Tommy's lawyers felt they had created reasonable doubt. On the first vote, the jurors were evenly split. 6 guilty, 6 not guilty. But over the course of 3 days, things changed. One juror, the final holdout, claimed she and others were coerced.
I was pressured in it. I didn't just feel it. I was pressured into it.
Before she died, Irma Brickell said another juror used one of the guns in evidence to intimidate her by repeatedly clicking it behind her head. Others shouted at her. She sent a note to the judge, but he refused to see her. Twice, Irma Brickell passed out. But this process would not be stopped. Judge Paul allowed a doctor to provide Irma Brickell with medication.
I got sort of sick, and they called the doctor, and he just sent some tablets, and they turned out to be Valium. They fix you where you do not make a decision that you would normally make.
Not long after that, she gave in to the pressure. She went to her grave regretting it.
I feel he's innocent.
The jury found Tommy Ziegler guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of second-degree murder. They recommended he be sentenced to life in prison. Judge Paul had other plans, though. It was July 1976, the very month Florida reinstated the death penalty. And Judge Paul decided to use it on Tommy.
His feeling may have been that 3 innocent lives were taken, 4 innocent lives were taken, and that simply a life sentence wasn't enough.
It's been 37 years since Florida reinstated the death penalty. That same year, 1976, a judge sentenced Tommy Ziegler to death after a jury found him guilty of murdering his wife, her parents, and another man. He says he didn't do it. Tommy has spent decades behind bars poking holes in the state's case against him. The challenges began soon after the trial ended. And Tommy, he had help along the way.
But nearly 37 years later, questions remain about the state's case against Tommy. Among them, was he assumed innocent until proven guilty? Not according to one of the arresting officers. After the trial, Lee McEachern, one of the cops who arrested Tommy, dropped a bombshell. He said before Tommy's trial started, he heard Judge Paul make a deal with the state attorney, Bob Egan.
Okay, Bob, just get me 1 conviction and I'll fry the son of a bitch.
Both men denied that conversation took place, and a state court ruled the accusation was not credible. Through the years, lawyers for Tommy Ziegler have filed several motions for post-conviction relief. Many of their complaints are based on information they learned long after the trial. For example, during the trial, prosecutors withheld a recording of an eyewitness named John Jellison talking to a state investigator. Jellison was staying in a hotel behind the furniture store on Christmas Eve. He reported seeing a police officer with a gun drawn before he heard shots fired. That contradicted the sequence of events investigators had established.
As long as you heard the gunshots after, you saw the police cars, then that wouldn't help us a bit.
Even after the investigator hints for Jellison to reorder what he saw, Jellison sticks with his story.
Starting to let you know, you all get together and decide you heard those gunshots, before you saw the police car. In that case, we'd give you a free trip back to Florida.
Jurors never heard from John Jellison because the state suppressed the evidence. The defense didn't learn about it until it was released following a Freedom of Information request 12 years after the trial. Vernon Davids believes it could have undermined the state's theory and created reasonable doubt in Tommy's favor.
The concealing of the Jellison tape, that would have been devastating at trial.
By the time this reached an appeals court, the recording fell on deaf ears. The court, in essence, said Tommy should have brought it up sooner. Motion denied. And there was this little detail. During the initial investigation, homicide detective Donald Fry, the same man who arrested Tommy Ziegler, wrote about interviewing a witness named Robert Foster, a man with a long criminal history who knew the victim, Charlie Mays. But during a sworn deposition, when Tommy's lawyers tried to learn more about this witness, Detective Fry said the name Robert Foster didn't register with him. It must be a typographical error.
We knew Robert Foster, yes. But when you're told by the chief detective that the man is a typographical error, what do? Do you believe him? Or do you waste time when you're pressed for time to keep fighting and try to find him?
Remember, time was never on Tommy's side. This trial was on a fast track. So Robert Foster was forgotten until a private investigator named Lynn Marie Carty, who has worked on Tommy's behalf without pay for 2 years, tracked Foster down in 2011. This is a current picture of Robert Foster, who now lives in Tallahassee.
So I was in the bottom of the courthouse with this woman.
Carty also learned that Foster, the same man the prosecution called a typographical error, was suspected of trying to hold up a gas station across from Ziegler's furniture store on the same night of the murders.
So let me get this straight. This guy goes and does an attempted robbery of a gas station, apparently not wearing a mask, not hiding his appearance in any way. He then goes across the street and murders 4 people for who knows what reason, and then sticks around afterwards to be viewed in the crowd. But this is just sort of the lunacy of these continued defense tactics. They come up with these bizarre stories and expect us to just leave our credibility out the window.
The discovery of Robert Foster prompted a hearing last year before Circuit Judge Reginald Whitehead. As usual, it did not go Tommy's way. The judge ruled that Robert Foster's appearance would not have made any difference in the outcome of his trial. It's now up to the Florida Supreme Court to decide if Judge Whitehead's ruling is correct. This is the only appeal Tommy Ziegler has pending. Last month, the Supreme Court denied his request for a second round of DNA testing because, like the first round of testing in 2001, the court said DNA could not prove that he was not the killer.
We gave them his due process. We fully fleshed out the record. And the court found that, in fact, as the Supreme Court had said more than a decade before, these DNA test results just don't tell us anything definitive one way or the other.
So what's next? Well, if the Supreme Court rules against Tommy in the coming days, upholding a lower court decision that Robert Foster's testimony would not change anything, then Tommy may be right about justice system decisions being set in concrete, even if those decisions take 37 years to cure and seal.
He will die on death row one way or the other, whether that's of natural causes or by the hands of the state, I don't know.
Neither does Tommy, but he vows to keep fighting and looking for ways to clear his name until his last breath.
Is there any other way that I can prove my innocence? Please tell me something else, and I'll do it.
We don't know if Tommy Ziegler is telling the truth. He may be guilty, but there's no denying that he and others working on his behalf have done a good job of creating doubt, something his lawyers didn't have time to do during his speedy trial in 1976. Had all these details been revealed to the jury, would they have rendered a different verdict? We'll never know. What we do know is this: Tommy Ziegler has spent nearly 37 years on death row trying to clear his name, while the state of Florida has spent the same amount of time defending its decision to execute him. It's a standoff. Tommy Ziegler's death on hold.